January 11, 1944. High above central Germany, the sky was already filled with the distant rumble of engines. American heavy bombers were crossing the continent once again, flying toward industrial targets deep inside the Third Reich. For German fighter pilots, this kind of mission had become routine. Radar stations along the coast had detected the bomber formations hours earlier. The information passed quickly through the Luftwaffe command network. Airfields across northern and central Germany scrambled their fighters. Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds and Focke-Wulf FW 190 seconds roared down runways and climbed into the winter sky. These pilots had done this many times before. For over a year, Germany's fighter force had fought a brutal, defensive battle against the growing waves of American bombers. Every week, the formations grew larger. Every month, the missions pushed deeper into German territory. But the German fighter force had a reliable tactic, and it had worked. American bombers rarely flew alone. They were escorted by fighters, usually P-47, Thunderbolts, or P-38 Lightnings, but those escorts had one major weakness: range. The escort fighters could only accompany the bombers for a limited distance before they had to turn back toward England. Fuel determined everything. German pilots had learned to watch carefully. They knew roughly where American fighters would reach their fuel limit. Once the escorts turned around, the bombers were suddenly alone over hostile territory. That was when the Luftwaffe struck. German fighters climbed above the bomber streams and waited patiently for the moment when the escorts disappeared. Then they attacked. The bombers, heavy and slow compared to fighters, were vulnerable even with their defensive guns, and the losses had been enormous. American bomber crews knew the danger well. In October 1943, the Second Schweinfurt mission had become one of the most devastating air battles of the war. American B-17 bombers, flying without adequate escort, had been savagely attacked by German fighters for hours. 60 bombers were destroyed in a single day. Hundreds of airmen were killed or captured. For the United States Army Air Forces, losses at that level were almost impossible to sustain. If missions continued like that, the entire daylight bombing campaign over Germany could collapse. But American planners were already working on a solution: a fighter that could go the distance, a fighter that could stay with the bombers the entire way. On January 11, 1944, German pilots were about to encounter that solution for the first time. The intercept. German radar stations had tracked the bomber stream approaching from the west. The targets that day were Brunswick and Oschersleben, important industrial centers supporting German aircraft production. The bomber formations belonged to the 8th Air Force. Flying from bases in England, hundreds of aircraft filled the sky. B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators flew in massive defensive formations designed to protect each other with overlapping machine gun fire. German fighter units received their orders quickly, climb to interception altitude, form attack groups, prepare to strike. Once the escorts turned back, for the Luftwaffe, this was a familiar routine. Fighters from multiple wings began assembling above the bomber routes. Pilots scanned the distant horizon for the first signs of the American formation. Soon they saw them, long rows of bombers glinting in the sunlight. Above them and around them were the escort fighters. At first, everything appeared normal. German pilots recognized the bulky silhouettes of P-47 Thunderbolts. They also saw the distinctive twin boom shapes of P-38 Lightnings. These were familiar opponents. The Thunderbolt was powerful, but heavy. The Lightning was fast, but sometimes difficult to maneuver in combat. German pilots had learned how to fight both. More importantly, they knew those fighters would not stay forever. Sooner or later, the escorts would turn back, and when they did, the bombers would be alone. The Luftwaffe pilots continued climbing and positioning themselves for the moment they had been waiting for the turn. Far below them, the bomber formations continued moving steadily eastward. The escort fighters flew close around them. Minutes passed. German pilots watched carefully. They expected to see the escorts peel away at any moment. That was always how it happened. Eventually, the American fighters would reach the edge of their fuel range. Then they would turn west and head back toward England. It was simply unavoidable. Fuel tanks were finite. Engines consumed fuel quickly during combat. Even the best fighter aircraft could not stay over Germany for long. That had been the reality of the air war for years. German fighter commanders relied on that limitation. It gave them control over the battle. They could decide when to attack. They could attack bombers when the escorts were gone, and if the situation turned dangerous, German fighters could dive away and escape. But on this day, the expected moment never arrived. German pilots kept watching. The P-47s did begin turning away as usual. That part of the pattern remained the same. But something else appeared in the sky. New fighters. At first, they looked unfamiliar. They were slimmer than the Thunderbolt. They had a long, narrow nose. Their cockpit canopy had a smooth, rounded shape. Their wings looked unusually thin and elegant. German pilots had never seen aircraft quite like them. These fighters formed up around the bombers, and they stayed. They did not turn back. They did not peel away. They continued flying deeper into Germany. Some German pilots were confused. Others assumed the aircraft must also have limited range. Perhaps they would turn back soon. But the longer they watched, the clearer the situation became. These fighters were not leaving. The Mustang appears. The aircraft the German pilots were seeing was the North American P-51 Mustang, specifically the P-51B, the newest long-range escort fighter in the American arsenal. The Mustang had been designed originally for the British Royal Air Force. But when engineers installed the powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the aircraft's performance changed dramatically. Suddenly, the Mustang had speed, range, and altitude performance that few fighters in the world could match. Most importantly, it could fly much farther than previous escort fighters. With external drop tanks, the Mustang could escort bombers deep into Germany and still have enough fuel to fight enemy aircraft. This was the breakthrough American planners had been waiting for. For the first time, bombers would have protection for the entire mission. German pilots did not yet understand what they were facing. To them, these new fighters were simply unfamiliar aircraft that had appeared among the escorts. But the Luftwaffe pilots soon noticed something else. These fighters were fast, very fast. At high altitude, the P-51B could reach around 440 miles per hour. That made it one of the fastest piston engine fighters in the war. Speed alone was not everything, but it mattered enormously in air combat. A faster fighter could control the engagement. It could chase or escape. It could dive faster. It could reposition quickly during battle. German pilots flying Bf 109 seconds and FW 190 seconds were used to having those advantages. Now, they were about to face an opponent that could match them. The first engagements. Eventually, the moment of combat arrived. German fighters began their attack runs toward the bomber formations. They approached at high speed, firing cannons and machine guns as they passed through the defensive formations. But this time, something different happened. Instead of reacting defensively, the escort fighters attacked them. The Mustangs moved aggressively. They climbed above the bomber stream and intercepted the German fighters. Before they could organize their attacks, dogfights erupted across the sky. German pilots immediately noticed something unusual. The new American fighters stayed close, very close. Normally, escort fighters would engage briefly, then withdraw as fuel became a concern. But these fighters did not withdraw. They stayed in the fight. If a German pilot tried to dive away to escape, the Mustangs followed. If he tried to climb, they stayed with him. The Merlin engine gave the Mustang strong high-altitude performance. It did not lose power as quickly as some other engines at high altitude, and it could sustain high speed for long periods. This allowed the Mustang to remain in combat longer than many fighters. One German pilot later wrote about his first encounter with the aircraft. He described attacking a bomber formation as usual when a group of unfamiliar fighters appeared above them. At first, he assumed they were Thunderbolts, but as the fight developed, he realized these aircraft behaved very differently. They did not disengage. They followed every maneuver, and when German pilots attempted to escape by diving away at full power, the Mustangs simply followed them. That had almost never happened before. A new reality. For German fighter pilots, the realization came quickly. Something fundamental had changed. For years, the Luftwaffe had controlled the terms of battle over Germany. They had chosen when to attack. They had chosen when to disengage. Fuel limitations forced American escorts to leave the bombers exposed. But now, those limitations were gone. The Mustang could go anywhere the bombers went. And that meant German fighters could no longer attack safely. If they attacked the bombers, they would have to fight the escorts all the way. And if the fight turned against them, escaping would become much harder. This single change altered the balance of the air war. The bomber formations were no longer isolated targets. They were protected by fighters that could remain with them from England to Germany and back again. German pilots did not yet realize how dramatic the consequences would be, but many of them sensed immediately that something important had happened. They had just encountered a fighter that could change the entire air war, the P-51 Mustang. And this was only the beginning.